So it's been in the news lately that Amazon is going to release a Lord of the Rings based series, and I am optimistically skeptical of it. There is, they are rolling off of the success of shows like Game of Thrones, which personally Game of Thrones never personally interested me for whatever reason. It looked, it always looked a bit too much like, oh, we're trying to be dark and gritty and rolling off the success of Lord of the Rings. Um, Basically, I always felt there was a little bit too try hard in relation to Tolkien's work. But uh, the Amazon show looks to be getting a large budget. And reasonably good writers, and they're going to be filming in New Zealand, which is always always nice. The landscape there is never going to be uninteresting, that's for sure. But I have this very bad feeling that it's going to devolve to Game of Thrones with elves. Um, Modern audiences want something dark and edgy and rather than sticking to, because they've decided to do a portion of, with this series, they've decided to do a portion of the Second Age that Tolkien doesn't really cover that much. So they think they can just go off and do whatever they want, but that almost makes it worse. So my first thought when I heard about this was that it would just be a straight up remake of the remake of the movies, or take the books, the original books, and remake and make them as a TV show. And I can see 101 ways that could go wrong just right off the bat. But that fear was slightly allayed when they said Second Age, because the Second Age is, first of all, it hasn't been covered by a movie. Second of all, it's far enough back that whatever they do doesn't technically affect anything. It's one of those like grace periods in the timeline where nothing really happens. So as long as we make sure that nothing matters, we're fine. But that also leads down the other road of this could turn into Game of Thrones with elves. And that is not something I want to see. My hope is that they stick to a Tolkien-esque vision, the idea of tragedy rescued by eucatastrophe, which is a term Tolkien coined. So, for example, I'd say the best example of eucatastrophe in Tolkien's work that people are liable to know about is when, at the very end of The Two Towers, when Gollum takes the ring from Frodo and then slips and falls into the fires of Mount Doom. That's a eucatastrophe, because Frodo was about to simply take the One Ring for himself, and therefore, what would in other cases have been a bad thing, a catastrophe, is sort of rescued by its effects, I guess you could say. Or there's also, running through all of Tolkien's work, is the Augustinian Christian idea that evil is essentially a sort of a vacuum. It's not a positive. It's hard to explain this, but very many TV shows and movies treat evil as a positive force. The bad guys are the ones who are active, whereas the good guys are reactive, for example. So you constantly see this over and over and over. The Avengers movies are a wonderful example of this. The heroes don't really do anything until somebody shows up and starts wrecking stuff, and they make sure to give the bad guys motivations for why they can do that, and it makes for relatively interesting television. The problem is that it doesn't present a picture of the world as I or Tolkien see it, because if you look at the history of Middle Earth that Tolkien compiled, the forces of evil never create anything. I mean, that's very important, because you'll go, okay, well, didn't Sauron or Morgoth create the elves? Well, sorry, no, the orcs. No, they didn't create the orcs. They took beings that were already existing in the world. The usual explanation is that they took elves and corrupted them. Trolls, for example, are corrupted Ents, or at least, or to quote Treebeard in The Two Towers from the book, they were made in mockery of the Ents. So there is a distinct lack of ability to create something new on the part of the villains. Excuse me. That leads down to the idea that also evil constantly undermines itself. You can't be actually evil and capable of selfless action, for example, which ends up meaning that the forces of evil will in the end undermine themselves. It's the force of evil of greed for the ring that causes that was built into the ring as a means of preserving it, that leads to its destruction. So if they stick to that vision of the world, and if they realize that they don't need rampant nudity in order for something to be worth watching by people over 5, then I think they'll do all right. But there's just so many ways to go wrong. I'm optimistically skeptical. In other words, I'll watch it. I'll give it a go. I watched the Hobbit movies. How much worse could it be? Speaking of the Hobbit movies, what the hell was anybody on those movies even thinking? Seriously. They were all over the place in tone, in story. Nothing made sense. See, this is why you don't take a book that's one book, just one, and expand it into 3 movies. A lot of people criticize Peter Jackson for leaving things out of The Lord of the Rings, but I kind of view that as a necessary evil. If you were going to adapt it into from a literary medium to a visual medium, you're going to end up leaving things out. And what you leave out, um, it can be hard to decide. But if they had kept the book in its entirety intact when they made it into a movie, just made, you know, every single beat by beat scene, then we would have gotten a movie approximately 10 times longer than the one we got. And nobody would have sat through the theaters for it except the most hardcore Tolkien fans. The only people who would have even possibly sat through it would have been like me and a couple of other people who were just so enamored of Tolkien that we will disregard all concept of time in order to experience some of his work. But that's people like that don't make a movie successful. So they cut things out in order to improve the pace and flow and rhythm of the story for a visual medium, because pace, flow, rhythm, stuff like that, it works very differently from literary medium to visual medium, because in a literary medium you can slow down and expand things and then keep things interesting by detail. Whereas if you lose the main drive of the plot, or if you had an interlude at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring movie, similar to the one you had in the book, where Frodo basically sits around in the Shire for 27 years, people would have dipped out then. But because things roll swiftly on, beat to beat to beat, it keeps audience engagement. So most of what was changed from book to screen in the Lord of the Rings movies was omission. Cut things out to make things work. Whereas in The Hobbit, they added stuff, and that is never going to work, because you have this book that was written originally as a children's fairy tale, and it works very well as a children's fairy tale. It was one of my favorite books of all time until I got The Lord of the Rings, which was one of my favorite books of all time till I got The Silmarillion, which was, again, one of my favorites till I got my hands on The Children of Húrin, which is simply an expanded tale from The Silmarillion. But, you know, going back to the point, The Hobbit book is a relatively short, snappy fairy tale that rolls swiftly from point to point to point. Adapting it to film should have been almost as easy as taking it and then filming it beat by beat by beat. And they kind of did that in the first Hobbit movie, or near enough that I was, at the end of it, excited and optimistic. I wasn't thrilled at the inclusion of Azog, because that guy was dead in the book and had been for quite a while, and just never made an appearance, so I was not thrilled about that. But I was willing to excuse it if we got more Middle Earth. And then the second movie happened. And it ended, and I was still quietly optimistic. I bought the extended edition. I mean, I was optimistic. Then the third movie happened, and I was done. I watched it, and it was like, I couldn't I couldn't deal with the level of silliness that they injected, because even though it was a children's fairy tale originally, it had a level of uh, realism. Not really, but there were lots of like good little grounding details in it, like, you know, cram, for example, the sort of hard biscuit-like bread used by the men of Lake Town for long journeys. I always thought that that was a really nice little detail to include, the sort of hardtack stuff that uh, that nobody likes, but that everybody agrees is somehow useful. Great little detail in the book, totally skipped in the movie, but um, and then you get a sort of a run on from that in the Lord of the Rings, um, when the Fellowship are in Lothlorien in the books. They are given a gift of lembas, which is this almost magical way bread used by the elves. And Gimli's first reaction is that it's just cram. It's the same stuff that the men of Lake Town use. And technically it is, but nowhere near as nasty to eat. Which I always thought was sort of this fun little run-on detail. It's like, yes, there is some similarity, but this stuff made by the elves is better in a very obvious way. Um, Sorry, I'm just diving into my love of all the little details in Tolkien's work. I could go on and on and on about this probably for the rest of my life. But the problem that occurred when uh, Peter Jackson made The Hobbit is that he was forced to expand it, and expand it by adding in original material while working on an incredibly chaotic schedule dictated by, I think there were like 4 different studios, and he was picking up the pieces after the other director, I think it was Guillermo del Toro, abandoned ship. So, just it was just a perfect storm of every bad decision that could possibly be made when making movies was made. The overuse of CGI led to everything looking sort of weird and cartoony. Um, it, it was never, none of the fights were believable the way they had been in The Lord of the Rings. Um, I would see just like this rubbery mass of, it just looked like flailing bits of rubber all the time. And it was just awful. Um, the stunts were way too stunty, I guess. Like, there's no way to justify this as something a physical human could do without, you know, planning out ahead. And I mean, just compare the fights in The Hobbit to the fights in Lord of the Rings, and you'll see what I mean. Also, the armor and weapons seem to get a massive downgrade in quality, and I think that might be because they stopped paying attention to John Howe and Alan Lee, who had designed all the weapons and armor or at least had a heavy hand in the designs of the weapons and armor for the first trilogy. So, and then they had Peter Lyon as well, swordsmith, who was an actual swordsmith. He knew what it took to make swords and axes and spears and stuff actually work as weapons. So that's why when you look at all the weaponry and the armor in the Lord of the Rings, it all has this sort of, it all looks real and practical and usable. And then you look at the stuff in The Hobbit, and it does not look real or practical or usable in any way. And I just have to ask myself, what in Hades were they thinking? Just over and over and over again. What were they thinking? Because and my worry is that rather than getting more Lord of the Rings, more Middle Earth, we get more of The Hobbit, which was bizarro Middle Earth, I guess. And I'm not at all sure that I want that. Now, I'm still very cautiously optimistic. I will wait and withhold judgment until I've seen at least the first episode, but it's going to be very hard to convince me that this is going to be a good thing. Anyways, that's enough of my rambling. Talk to you tomorrow.